There are rules to running a war. You track your assets. You confirm their arrival. You answer their calls for help. For the USS Indianapolis, every one of those rules was broken. After delivering the atomic bomb, it didn't just sink, it sailed into a procedural black hole. This isn't just the story of an attack. It's an investigation into a crime scene where the victim was a 10-00T ton cruiser, and the system designed to protect it was the main accomplice. Come with me for a moment. Let's leave this quiet archive room behind and travel back in time. Not to the frantic chaos of a beach landing or the screaming fury of a dogfight over Europe. No, our story begins in a place of profound, almost hypnotic calm. The setting is the Philippine Sea. The date is July 30th, 1945. The war, for all intents and purposes, is won. Germany has fallen. The cities of Japan are burning. And on the black, glassy surface of the water, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis is cutting its way home. Imagine you are a lookout, perched high above the deck. It's just after midnight. The air is thick and warm, heavy with the salt of the Pacific. Below you, the ship is a living thing, a city of steel breathing in the dark. You can feel the steady, reassuring thrum of its 4 powerful steam turbines vibrating up through the soles of your feet, a 17-knot heartbeat pushing 1,196 men through the night. The moon is hidden. The sea and sky have melted into a single, seamless bowl of ink, pricked here and there by the cold, indifferent light of the stars. The only other light is the ghostly white of the ship's own wake, a phosphorescent trail stretching back into the endless dark. For the men of the Indianapolis, this is the easy part. This is the milk run. Just 4 days ago, they completed the most important and secret mission of the entire war. Sailing from San Francisco at a record-breaking speed, they delivered a small, lead-lined crate to the island of Tinian. They didn't know its contents, only that it was precious beyond measure, guarded by men with sidearms who never left its side. They delivered the heart of the atomic bomb, the fissile uranium, for little boy. They had carried the instrument of apocalypse, and now, their duty done, they were sailing to Leyte to prepare for the final invasion of Japan. There's a feeling of relief on board, of a job well done. The war is almost over. They can feel it. The plan, on paper, was perfect. A straight shot from Guam to Leyte. The route was considered so safe, so far behind the front lines, that the high command in Guam had decided against a destroyer escort. An escort, they reasoned, would just slow the cruiser down. The Indianapolis was fast enough to outrun any submarine. This was the logic of the map. The clean, confident, unassailable logic of a war winding down. Then, at 14 minutes past midnight, the logic of the map met the reality of the sea. Without warning, a light brighter than 1,000 suns erupts from the starboard bow. It's not a sound you hear first. It's a feeling of brutal, physical impact, as if the ship has been punched by the fist of God. A column of water and fire 60 feet high climbs into the night sky, and a moment later, a second, even more catastrophic explosion tears through the ship's center, right below the forward smokestack. The steel deck beneath your feet, once as solid as bedrock, ripples like a carpet. The ship lurches violently, a wounded animal stabbed in the heart. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the engines dies instantly, replaced by the horrifying shriek of tortured metal, the roar of flash-fed flames, and a sound that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives: the sudden, panicked screams of 1,000 men waking from a dream and finding themselves in hell. The entire electrical system is gone. The ship is plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness, broken only by the raging orange fires that now cast dancing, demonic shadows across the decks. The bow is already gone, sheared clean off by the first torpedo. The second has hit fuel tanks and powder magazines, creating an inferno midship. The Indianapolis, the proud flagship of the Fifth Fleet, the ship that had carried the president and survived 10 major battles, is dying. And it is dying impossibly fast. But in the chaos and the terror of those first few seconds, as men scramble through the dark on decks slick with oil and blood, the true anomaly isn't the attack itself. In war, ships get hit. The anomaly, the cold, terrifying mystery at the heart of this story, is something else entirely. It's the silence. The radio room is a twisted wreck. The distress calls that are sent are frantic, broken, and weak. No one on shore seems to hear them. No one seems to know anything has happened. The ship had carried the key to ending the Second World War. And now, as it begins its final, fatal plunge into the abyss, it has utterly and completely vanished off the face of the earth. How could a 10,000-ton cruiser, on a designated route, with nearly 1,200 souls aboard, simply cease to exist without the most powerful navy in the world even noticing it was gone? Back on land, in the sweltering humidity of Leyte, the United States Navy was not a collection of men. It was a vast, self-regulating machine, an immense organism of logistics, timetables, and procedure. Its brain was the port director's office, a place that ran on the steady rhythm of teletypes, the clink of coffee mugs, and the quiet scratch of grease pencils on a massive, wall-sized plotting board. This board was the altar upon which the gospel of the war was written. On it, the entire Philippine Sea was rendered in clean, predictable lines, and every ship was a small, movable icon, its course and speed a matter of established, unwavering fact. On the morning of July 31st, Lieutenant Stuart B. Gibson, the acting port director, was running through his arrivals list. His eyes scanned the neat columns of ship names and ETAs. He was looking for one in particular, CA-35, the USS Indianapolis. She was due at 1,100 hours. But 1,100 came and went. Then noon. Then the early afternoon. The small icon representing the cruiser remained stubbornly absent from the harbor. This was the first moment the plan on paper began to diverge from reality. But inside the machine, an anomaly doesn't immediately trigger alarm, it triggers a cascade of logical, comforting assumptions. High Command, in its wisdom, assumed the ship was simply late, proceeding with discipline and without breaking radio silence for a minor delay. There was no protocol for a major combatant vessel to simply go missing in a safe rear area. The system had no box to put that scenario in. The official story, therefore, was that there was no story. The ship was just late. On the great plotting board in Leyte, the symbol for CA-35 was not removed. It was simply marked with a small question mark. That question mark, a minor clerical inconvenience in the air-conditioned quiet of Leyte, was a death sentence in the Philippine Sea. By then, the first day under the blistering sun had passed. The men's lips were cracked and bleeding. They huddled together in shrinking groups, their eyes scanning a horizon that offered nothing but its own indifferent curve. The first of the delirious began to drink the salt water, their minds breaking under a thirst that felt like swallowing fire. And in the cool of the evening, as the sun dipped below the waves, the sharks arrived. War is a battle of realities. And while the official reality was being calmly debated in Leyte, the ground reality had already screamed for help. In the early morning hours of July 30th, just minutes after the attack, the desperate, dying whispers of the Indianapolis were not lost in the static of the Pacific, they were lost in the static of human error and bureaucratic indifference. A young radio man named R.G. Twitchell, stationed on Peleliu, was the first to hear the ghost. He was startled by a burst of frantic Morse code that clawed its way through the oceanic noise. It was garbled and faint, but he made out enough to chill his blood in SOS, followed by what looked like the Indianapolis's call sign. He logged it and passed it up the chain, where it vanished into a file of unconfirmed signals. A second station, on Leyte itself, also caught a fragment. An Army radio operator heard a desperate plea before it was swallowed by the ether. But here, the fog of war took a more sinister, human form. The commander on duty that night was known to be a heavy drinker. When the young operator reported the distress call, the commander, annoyed at being disturbed, dismissed it out of hand. "It's a Jap trick," he slurred, waving the man away. "Forget it." The message, a potential lifeline for 1,000 men, was discarded because of one man's cynicism and a bottle of whiskey. A third station confirmed a signal, but logged it as unintelligible. This is the contradiction buried deep in the archives, the detail that changes everything. High Command's official position was one of serene, unknowing calm. They believed the Indianapolis was safe because they had received no word to the contrary. But the truth is, the word had been sent. The ship had cried out. 3 separate listening posts had caught pieces of the ship's death agony, and in each case, the system had concluded it was a mistake, a prank, or a phantom. The machine, designed to process information, had actively rejected the one piece of information that mattered. And so, as the second day dawned, the official explanation that the ship was simply and safely overdue was cemented as fact, a fatal illusion of order. In the water, that illusion was being torn apart. Men, their bodies slick with fuel oil that was now baking into their skin, began to die from their wounds and from dehydration. The groups fractured as madness took hold. Men would suddenly scream that the ship was just below the surface, offering fresh water, and would swim down into the abyss, never to return. The living, too weak to help, could only watch. The official silence in Leyte was answered by a horrifying silence in the Pacific, as one by one, the voices of the dying stopped calling for help. The mystery of the Indianapolis was no longer about a missing ship. It had become something far more dangerous, a flaw in the system. To understand why this silence was so catastrophic, you have to understand the fundamental principle of naval warfare in the Pacific. Let's do a quick war college briefing. Imagine the Pacific Ocean is a vast, dark room. Your Navy is a group of people trying to navigate it. Without a system, it's chaos. Now, give every person a radio and a watch, and put one person in charge with a master map. This is naval plotting. The map holder is high command. They know where everyone is, where they're going, and when they're supposed to arrive. This system, this plot, is the only thing that separates a coordinated fleet from 1,000 scattered, vulnerable ships. It is built on a sacred, unbreakable covenant. Every ship reports its position, and every command post tracks its progress. The USS Indianapolis was a critical piece in that system. Its designated route from Guam to Leyte wasn't just a line on a map, it was a promise. It was a guarantee logged in the operational ledgers of at least 3 separate commands. The ship was a baton being passed in a high-stakes relay race. Guam had passed it. Leyte was supposed to receive it. The problem was, when Leyte didn't, no one thought to check back with the previous runner. This is where the flaw in the system became a chasm. The responsibility for the Indianapolis's safety was not assigned to a single commander. It was a blurry, overlapping jurisdiction, a no-man's land of accountability. Everyone believed someone else was watching the ship. In reality, no one was. So, when the ship failed to arrive, the system didn't just fail to act, it was designed not to. No one at Leyte radioed Guam to ask, "Hey, did CA-35 leave on time?" No one in Guam radioed Leyte to confirm, "Did our package arrive?" The Indianapolis had sailed directly into a blind spot on the map, a procedural dead zone created by the fog of war's most insidious agent, bureaucracy. The ticking clock was now counting down to a moment of institutional disgrace. As each hour passed, the failure to notice the ship's absence was compounding. The Indianapolis wasn't just a missing ship, it was a ghost haunting the machine, and its silence was a testament to a catastrophic breakdown in the very system designed to prevent such a tragedy. The hunt for the truth was no longer just about finding the ship, it was about saving the Navy from itself. But that hunt hadn't even begun, because as far as the world was concerned, there was nothing yet to find. For 4 agonizing days, the world forgot the USS Indianapolis. For days of silent plotting boards and unquestioned assumptions. For days while hundreds of men, scattered across 100 square miles of open ocean, drifted under a merciless sun. But the fog of war, for all its power to obscure, cannot erase reality forever. Eventually, the truth finds a way to break through. And in this story, it broke through not with a flash of insight in a command bunker, but with the drone of a twin-engine patrol bomber flying a routine, mind-numbingly dull anti-submarine sweep. The date is August 2nd. The time is 11:25 a.m. The man is Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn, a pilot flying a PV-1 Ventura bomber. His mission is simple: fly a long, straight line over an empty patch of ocean, look for the telltale feather of a periscope, see nothing, and fly home. Gwynn was wrestling with a faulty antenna for his long-range navigation system. He banked the Ventura, craning his neck to look back at the wire, hoping to see what was wrong. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't a periscope. It was an oil slick, a massive, iridescent stain spreading across the cobalt blue of the Pacific, a smear of liquid rainbow that shouldn't have been there. Gwynn was a veteran. He knew what an oil slick meant. It meant a ship was bleeding. He banked his plane and descended, his heart starting to pound against his ribs. The official story in his mind that this was an empty, safe sector of the ocean was colliding with the evidence of his own eyes. As he dropped lower, the slick resolved into something more horrifying. At first, they looked like coconuts or debris bobbing in the swell. Then he saw an arm wave. They were heads, dozens of them, then hundreds. Men, clinging to rafts, to debris, to each other, their faces turned up to the sky. A vast, floating constellation of human misery. They were alive. Gwyn stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to process the scale of it. The plan on paper, the map in his cockpit, told him these men did not exist. He grabbed his radio, his voice tight with adrenaline. Cited 30 survivors in water. Send rescue. 30. That was his first, conservative estimate. He circled again, lower this time, and the true, sickening scope of the disaster revealed itself. The groups of men stretched for miles. This was the remnant of something huge. He corrected his report, his voice now strained with shock. More than 150 survivors. This was it. The first crack in the wall of silence. Gwyn's radio message was a grenade tossed into the quiet offices of the Pacific Fleet Command. It was a visual confirmation from a trusted pilot. Men were in the water. A lot of men. The mystery of what had happened out there in the Philippine Sea finally had a starting point. The machine, dormant for 4 days, roared to life. Finally, someone was coming. For the men in the water, it was a moment of impossible, delirious hope. For the commanders on land, it was the beginning of a frantic, desperate investigation to answer one terrifying question: who the hell were they? The discovery of the survivors should have been the beginning of a clean, efficient rescue. Instead, it was the moment the investigators realized they weren't just solving a puzzle, they were confronting an adversary who had laid the most perfect trap imaginable. And that adversary wasn't just the Japanese submarine that fired the torpedoes. It was the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Pacific Ocean itself, aided and abetted by the Navy's own fatal assumptions. The promising lead Gwyn's sighting immediately ran into a brutal dead end. When his report hit the command center, the first, most logical question was asked: cross-reference the location with the plots of all missing vessels. The operations officers checked their boards. They looked for a ship that was unaccounted for, a ship that should have been in that area. And they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Indianapolis, according to their own immaculate records, was not due in that sector. She was supposed to be safely docked in Leyte. The men in the water, therefore, could not be from the Indianapolis. It was a logical impossibility. The system, confronted with evidence that contradicted its own reality, defaulted to what it knew. The initial theory was that these must be the survivors of a smaller vessel. Or worse, that it was a Japanese trick, a collection of enemy sailors feigning distress to lure American rescue planes into an anti-aircraft trap. The initial excitement curdled into suspicion and confusion. The first planes dispatched were not giant PBY Catalina flying boats loaded with survival gear, but fighters, sent to scout and confirm the identity of the men in the water. Meanwhile, the enemy's genius, or rather, the sheer, dumb luck of his positioning, was becoming terrifyingly apparent. The man responsible was Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine I-58. He was not a rogue agent, he was a hunter operating on a sound premise. He knew the main shipping lanes were heavily patrolled, so he had positioned his submarine far away from them, in a quieter, less trafficked section of the sea, a place an American warship might take a shortcut. The U.S. Navy's own intelligence reports, which Captain McVey of the Indianapolis had reviewed before leaving Guam, had classified the threat from submarines in this very sector as low. This is the brutal irony that lies at the heart of the sinking. The Indianapolis was sunk not because it stumbled into a wolf pack, but because it sailed through a part of the ocean the Navy had officially declared safe. It was a statistical anomaly, a 1 in a million shot. Hashimoto wasn't even hunting for a cruiser. The Indianapolis, sailing alone, without zigzagging, on a moonless night, just happened to cross his periscope at the exact right moment. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, saw 2 massive explosions, and then, adhering to his own doctrine of survival, dove deep and slipped away into the silent darkness. He never knew the name of the ship he had hit. The simple theory that a ship had been sunk and a rescue was underway had now collapsed. The investigators were facing a nightmare scenario. They had hundreds of confirmed survivors in the water, but no missing ship to account for them. They were in a location that naval intelligence had deemed safe, meaning any attack there was, by definition, an intelligence failure. And the enemy who had caused this carnage had vanished without a trace. They weren't just looking for survivors anymore, they were staring into a black hole in their own intelligence, a void on the map where their most confident assumptions had gone to die. Just as the investigation was grinding to a halt, paralyzed by this contradiction, the breakthrough came. And it came, as it so often does in war, not from a strategic masterstroke, but from a moment of raw, defiant humanity, an act of insubordination that broke every rule in the book and, in doing so, saved what was left of the Indianapolis. The man was Lieutenant Adrian Marks. He was the pilot of a PBY Catalina flying boat, call sign Playmate 2, dispatched to the scene. His orders were clear and strict: fly over the survivors, assess the situation, drop survival gear, and report back. He was explicitly, unequivocally forbidden from landing. The PBY Catalina was a lumbering, fragile beast. Landing in the open ocean, especially in the 12-foot swells rolling through the Philippine Sea that day, was considered suicidal. The impact could rip the hull apart. The rule was inviolable. You do not land the PBY in open water. Marks arrived over the scene in the late afternoon. What he saw from his cockpit window was not a military situation, it was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The oil slick now stretched for miles, a black, viscous shroud upon the water. And within it, he saw men, hundreds of them, not waving, but dying. He saw groups huddled together, delirious from sun and salt water, their skin burned black. He saw lone figures floating face down. And then he saw the sharks. He watched, circling in helpless horror, as dorsal fins cut through the water, weaving through the groups of survivors, followed by sudden, panicked thrashing and clouds of red blooming in the black water. The plan on paper to drop rafts and wait for a rescue ship that was still hours away shattered against the brutal reality below. Mark saw a group of men being attacked. He looked at his co-pilot. He knew the order. He knew the risk. And in that moment, he made a decision. He was no longer a pilot following a flight plan. He was a man who could not watch other men be eaten alive. "We're going in," he said over the intercom. Ignoring the frantic calls from his base, Marks began his approach. He brought the massive plane down, fighting the controls as the wind and waves clawed at its wings. The landing was a controlled crash. The PBY slammed into the sea, bounced violently 3 times, and then, with a groaning shudder of strained rivets and buckling aluminum, it stayed afloat. The impact had sprung seams and popped rivets, and the plane was taking on water, but it was in one piece. Marks didn't just land. He transformed his aircraft from a plane into a lifeboat and a hospital. He taxied the wounded, leaking Catalina from group to group, his crew pulling the most grievously injured men from the shark-infested water. When the inside of the plane was full, they started tying men to the wings with parachute cord. By nightfall, Marks had crammed 56 survivors into and onto his sinking aircraft, a single point of light and hope in an ocean of death. His act of defiance was the key that unlocked everything. His radio report, sent from the surface of the water, was unambiguous. "We are on the water, amidst hundreds of survivors. They are from the USS Indianapolis." The name, spoken for the first time, struck the command centers in Leyte and Guam like a thunderclap. The Indianapolis, the ship that was supposed to be safe in harbor. The clerical anomaly with the question mark next to its name. The ghost was real. And Adrian Marks, floating in the dark in his broken airplane, surrounded by the dying, had just given it a name. The fog of war began to recede, replaced by the horrifying clarity of the truth. The name Indianapolis hung in the air of the command centers like an accusation. The moment Adrian Marks uttered it, the mystery of the floating survivors was solved, but a far darker and more dangerous investigation had just begun. This was the hunt for culpability. The contradiction between the clean plotting boards and the hundreds of dying men in the ocean was no longer a puzzle to be solved, but a crime scene to be analyzed. And as the first, frantic reports from the rescue ships began to filter back, a deeply uncomfortable truth started to emerge. This wasn't just an enemy action. This was a catastrophic, multi-layered failure of the United States Navy itself. The investigators, a hastily assembled board of inquiry, started pulling the threads, and the entire tapestry of command procedure began to unravel. They started with the most basic question: why was the ship's failure to arrive in Leyte never reported? They interviewed Lieutenant Gibson, who testified that he had simply assumed the ship was delayed. He had no orders, no standing procedure, that required him to report a combatant vessel overdue to a higher operational command. The responsibility, he insisted, lay elsewhere. So they followed the thread to the office of the commander, Philippine Sea Frontier. Here, the story became even murkier. Operations officers testified that they were responsible for routing ships, not tracking them individually unless they were part of a formal convoy. The Indianapolis, traveling alone, existed in a procedural limbo. They had provided the route, but the responsibility for confirming its safe arrival, they argued, fell to the destination port Leyte. It was a perfect circle of deferred responsibility. Then came the most damning discovery of all, buried in the logbooks of the Naval intelligence offices. The investigators found reports, dated just days before the Indianapolis set sail, detailing recent and successful Japanese submarine activity directly along the ship's proposed route. The submarine I-58, Hashimoto's vessel, had been specifically reported as having sunk a merchant ship in the vicinity. This critical intelligence, this clear warning that the safe corridor was, in fact, an active hunting ground, was never provided to Captain Charles McVey III. Why? Because the Indianapolis was not a frontline combat vessel on an offensive mission, the intelligence officers had not deemed this information relevant to its transit. This was the uncomfortable truth: the sinking of the USS Indianapolis was not an unavoidable tragedy of war. It was an avoidable disaster, born from a series of systemic flaws. It was a failure of plotting, a failure of reporting, and a catastrophic failure of intelligence sharing. The men in the water were victims not just of a Japanese torpedo, but of a bureaucracy that had routed them into danger, failed to provide them with the intelligence to avoid it, and then created a system so fragmented that no one was responsible for noticing when they vanished. This truth was politically radioactive. The Navy had just secured the greatest victory in its history. The story of the Indianapolis threatened to expose the gritty, fallible, and sometimes fatally incompetent reality beneath that pristine image. The system had failed, and now the system needed a scapegoat. The revelation that the Navy's own procedures were the chief accessory to the disaster sent a shockwave of panic through the highest levels of the Pacific Fleet. This was no longer an investigation into a tragedy, it was a damage control operation. The truth, in all its raw, systemic ugliness, was unacceptable. And so, the great machine of the military bureaucracy, which had so lethally failed to protect the Indianapolis, now mobilized with ruthless efficiency to protect itself. First, a strict press blackout was imposed. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. The 4 days of silence, the intelligence failures, the procedural black holes, these details were to be classified, buried in sealed reports. Second, and more critically, the system began its hunt for a single, identifiable cause. A system cannot be court-martialed. A flawed doctrine cannot be put on trial. But a man can. You can almost hear the quiet, unofficial conversation in the hallways of the Navy Yard, an admiral's aide pulling an investigator aside, saying the institution cannot be at fault. Find the failure on the ship, not in the system. The hunt for truth was over. The hunt for a scapegoat had begun. The focus of the investigation shifted away from the systemic failures of command and onto the actions of one individual, Captain Charles Butler McVey III. Suddenly, every decision McVey made was placed under a microscope and reinterpreted as a potential act of negligence. The investigators' questions took on an accusatory edge. "Captain, why were your lookouts not more effective?" They demanded, as if a pair of human eyes could pierce a moonless Pacific night and spot a torpedo track. The most damning line of inquiry focused on a single, discretionary order: zigzagging. Standard anti-submarine doctrine recommended a ship zigzag, but also gave a captain the discretion to cease in conditions of low visibility. McVey, acting on the intelligence that the area was safe and visibility was poor, had made the decision to cease zigzagging hours before the attack. This decision became the focal point of the entire inquiry. It was the perfect scapegoat. It was a clear action taken by a single commander that could be framed as a direct violation of best practice. The convenient truth was coalescing: the USS Indianapolis sank, not because of failed intelligence or a broken reporting system, but because its captain had failed to zigzag. It was a simple, clean, and brutally effective explanation that placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of one man, absolving the entire chain of command above him. This is the lowest point. The moment when the search for truth is officially abandoned in favor of the search for a sacrifice. In November 1945, just 3 months after the end of the war, the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, formally ordered Captain McVey to be court-martialed. The charges were twofold: failing to issue a timely order to abandon ship, and, the charge that truly mattered, hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. He would be the only captain in the history of the United States Navy to be court-martialed for losing his ship in an act of war. The trial was a masterclass in institutional theater, designed not to uncover the truth, but to ratify a preordained conclusion. The prosecution built its entire case around the single, isolated act of ceasing to zigzag. The wider context: the faulty intelligence, the lack of an escort, the failure of the Navy to even notice his ship was missing for 4 days, was ruled as inadmissible, irrelevant to the specific charges at hand. The most surreal and cruel moment of the trial was the appearance of a surprise witness for the prosecution. The Navy, in an unprecedented move, flew Commander Makitsura Hashimoto from a prisoner of war camp in Japan to Washington, D.C. to testify against the man whose ship he had sunk. Hashimoto, a man of honor, testified through an interpreter that visibility had been good that night and that, in his professional opinion, zigzagging would have made no difference. He had a clear shot, his torpedoes were advanced, and the outcome, he stated, would have been the same. The prosecution, stunningly, chose to ignore their own star witness. The court convicted McVey on the charge of hazarding his ship. The first charge was thrown out as patently absurd. The verdict was a strategic victory for the Navy. They had their conviction. They had their scapegoat. The official record now stated that the loss of the Indianapolis was the result of a captain's error. Though Fleet Admiral Nimitz remitted McVey's sentence and restored him to active duty, the damage was done. For the next 23 years, he lived with the crushing weight of a conviction for a crime he didn't commit. Worse, he lived with the mail. Every Christmas, he received a small, steady trickle of hate mail from the grieving families of men who died on his ship, letters that said things like, "Merry Christmas. If it weren't for you, my son would be here to celebrate." The catastrophe was now irrevocably set in motion. Not the sinking itself, but the deeper, more insidious tragedy of a falsified history. The truth of the systemic failure was buried, locked away in classified archives. The honor of a good man was sacrificed to protect the reputation of the institution. And the families of the dead and the survivors were left with a lie that would stand as the official truth for more than half a century. The fog of war had finally been replaced by a carefully constructed and legally enforced fog of peace. For decades, the story of the USS Indianapolis remained frozen in that Washington courtroom. But truth, like a body in the water, has a way of eventually rising to the surface. The first cracks in the official story didn't come from a declassified document, but from a middle school history project. In 1996, a 12-year-old boy in Florida named Hunter Scott chose the sinking of the Indianapolis for his project, captivated by the story after seeing the movie Jaws. Scott, with the simple, unblinking curiosity that only a child can possess, started his own investigation. He didn't have access to classified archives, but he had something more powerful: a telephone. He began tracking down the remaining survivors. He interviewed nearly 150 of them. He listened to their stories, not as a prosecutor looking for blame, but as a witness trying to understand. They spoke of their captain not with anger, but with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. They saw McVey not as the cause of their suffering, but as its chief victim alongside them. Hunter Scott's project became a crusade. His work gained national attention, and his research was presented to the United States Congress. He had stumbled upon the uncomfortable truth that the survivors had known all along: the system had failed, not the man. Then, the documents began to appear. In the late 1990s, driven by the renewed public interest, historians began using the Freedom of Information Act to pry open the Navy's long-sealed files. The declassified memos and reports started to paint the full, damning picture. There it was, in black and white, the intelligence report on Hashimoto's I-58, which McVey was never shown. The routing instructions that created the procedural black hole. The internal memos from the Board of Inquiry, revealing the pressure to focus the investigation solely on the captain. The transcripts from the 3 separate radio stations that had heard the SOS. The most powerful piece of evidence to reemerge was the full, translated testimony of Commander Hashimoto. He had not only stated that zigzagging would have made no difference, but he had sent a formal letter to the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee during their new hearings, reiterating his professional opinion. I would have been able to launch a successful torpedo attack against his ship whether it had been zigzagging or not, he wrote, his words echoing across 50 years of injustice. The declassified file was now open. The official story, so carefully constructed and legally enforced, crumbled under the weight of the declassified truth. The narrative of a negligent captain was exposed for what it was: a deliberate, calculated fiction designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the innocent. Jump forward in time with me to October 30th, 2000. We are in the halls of the United States Congress. An old man, a survivor of the sinking, stands quietly as a resolution is read into the official record. It is a joint resolution of the House and the Senate, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. The document states 2 simple, profound things. First, that the blame for the loss of the USS Indianapolis rests not with its captain, but with the United States Navy for its failure to properly route the ship and report its loss. And second, that Captain Charles Butler McVey III is, and shall henceforth be considered, fully and publicly exonerated for the loss of his ship. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. Captain McVey was not there to hear it. Tormented by the memory of the sinking and the unjust weight of his conviction, haunted by the letters from grieving families, he had taken his own life 32 years earlier, in 1968. He died clutching a small toy sailor in his hand, a good luck charm he had carried with him since childhood. His exoneration was a posthumous restoration of an honor that should never have been questioned. The vindication of Captain McVey was the final piece of the puzzle. With it, the entire, tragic mosaic of the Indianapolis disaster finally snapped into focus. Let's return to our War College briefing for one last, clarifying analogy. Think of Naval Command and Control as the human nervous system. Intelligence reports are the eyes and ears, sending signals to the brain high command. The brain processes these signals and sends orders down the spinal cord to the limbs, the ships at sea. The loss of the Indianapolis was a complete systemic failure of that nervous system. The eyes and ears naval intelligence saw the danger, but failed to send the signal to the brain. The brain high command issued an order to the arm the Indianapolis to move through a dangerous area, assuming it was safe. Then, when the arm was severed by the enemy, the pain receptors, the SOS calls, sent frantic signals back, but they were blocked by clots of bureaucracy and human error. The brain never received the message that the limb was gone. For 4 days, the body of the U.S. Navy continued to function as if it were whole, completely unaware that one of its limbs was bleeding out into the Pacific. The court-martial of Captain McVey was the equivalent of the brain, upon discovering the loss, blaming the severed arm for not moving out of the way fast enough. It was a profound, almost pathological act of denial. The declassified truth revealed that the real antagonist of this story was never just a Japanese torpedo. It was the fog of war in its most insidious form, the arrogance of a system that believed its own maps more than reality, its own procedures more than the lives of its men. The tragedy of the Indianapolis is not just that a ship was sunk. It's that it was abandoned twice, first by procedure in the vastness of the ocean, and then by justice in the corridors of power. The story of the USS Indianapolis is over, but its echoes remain. It stands as a permanent, chilling reminder that the most dangerous battles are often fought not against the enemy, but against our own worst tendencies, our pride, our bureaucracy, and our willingness to sacrifice a single truth for a comfortable lie. It teaches us that history is never truly settled, and that the search for truth, no matter how long it takes, is the only real monument we can build to the dead. The 316 who survived, and the 880 men who did not, finally have their story told. Their long silence in the Philippine Sea has, at last, been answered. That is our mission here, to stand as a final witness, long after the echoes of the battle have faded.